Word nerd, wordsmith, wordy, wordless. Oxford Dictionary says a word is a single, distinct, meaningful element of speech or writing, used with others or sometimes alone. We say each one matters. No extra words is literature, minimalist style. And we're getting you right to the story. Oma and Opa by Robert Wexelblatt. At least once a year, Grandfather told the tale of how he came to live in our town. I arrived as an orphan of 12, with nothing in the world except a pair of corduroy breeches, a linen shirt with 3 tears in it, and a pair of waterlogged boots. All of us knew this meager inventory of possessions by heart. We made jokes about it. I arrived as an orphan of 2, with nothing but a rattle and a bottle of sour milk. I arrived as an orphan of 1, with nothing but a dirty diaper and a couple of burlap booties. As toddlers, we often fell asleep during Grandfather's story. As adolescents, we'd wander off when he got to the waterlogged boots. Still, all of us had listened to the tale all the way through, at least once. When we were little, we believed every word. Later, scarcely any. Perhaps we resented that the old man's recollections, or extravagant fantasies, meant more to him than our precious selves. We would have preferred it had he doted on us, rather than the past. All the same, Grandfather's tale impressed us. It bonded us to our parents, our aunts and uncles, our many cousins. True or false, this story served, you might say, as the family's founding myth, notwithstanding the fact that the story isn't really about our family at all. Grandfather claimed to have been born in a northern town which no longer appears on any map. According to him, it styled itself a town rather than a village, owing to its prosperity rather than its size. It was a place where everybody knew everyone else. In fact, he said, half the population were related by blood. 2 well-behaved streams flowed through the town, fed by the runoff from the 2 mountains that loomed above and sheltered it. The people called them Opa and Oma. Thanks to the streams, the valley was well irrigated. The fields produced an abundance of crops, the meadows provided excellent pasture, and there was plenty of wood to be had on the slopes of Oma and Opa. Our town built its own power plant, and every house had electricity. We were well off. We had everything, including a fine library, a stone building with an arched portico and twice the number of books there are in the puny one here. 2 schools, 3 churches, even a movie theater. Our 6 shops were well stocked with imported luxuries. Even though there was no crime, we still paid for a constable and a jail. Gossip tended to be good-natured rather than spiteful. We counted our isolation in the mountains an advantage. I can't recall that anyone ever thought of moving away. According to Grandfather, the catastrophe commenced on the eve of his 11th Christmas. At first it was wonderful. Snow began to fall in big flakes, settling lightly at first, making everything clean and quiet. Our homes felt even cozier, fireplaces all ablaze. Christmas morning was coming. My sisters and I were excited. We got out our sleds and made for the largest hill as the grown-ups took down from the rafters and waxed them. Around midnight, the temperature dropped, and the wind rose. The snow didn't let up, it fell and fell. What began so benignly became a storm, then a blizzard, and finally something like a judgment. It snowed for 40 days and 40 nights. A judgment. When we were little, we found this a puzzling word to describe a snowstorm, but later, having learned something of the Bible, we dismissed it, believing that Grandfather was piling a moral extravagance atop a meteorological fantasy. The snow fell until it covered our windows, then rose higher than the roofs. Our wood piles dwindled and the power plant failed. Only the strongest men were able to get out of their houses. Still, we kept our spirits up. While there was still plenty of food, we children, unconcerned about collapsing roofs, frostbite, or school, enjoyed ourselves. Our parents brought back the old custom of bundling, rolling us up in woolen blankets for the night, 4 together. We had a spinet in the parlor, and my 2 sisters mounted a clever musical revue. Before we were snowed in, there were snow statues and contests to find the fattest icicles. When supplies ran dangerously low, the town's radio hobbyist put out a distress call, and there were a few supply drops. Children always are excited by anything extraordinary. Putting on snowshoes and venturing into the fields to retrieve these seemed to us a grand adventure. But there were terrible things, too, more and more of them. One man failed to return from the last attempt to gather up the goods from under the parachutes. There were 2 murders and as many suicides. The movie theater's roof fell in, as did the schools. The cows and sheep froze to death. At last, with the wood nearly gone, it was decided we would have to burn the library's books for fuel. There was a crazy debate about which should go first. The grown-ups came to blows over holding back their favorite authors, arguing for history ought to be sacrificed before poetry, botany before physics. Things grew desperate. Many starved, fell ill, or simply perished from the cold. Both my sisters, our mother, my teacher, and most of my friends, all of them died. Those who survived were weak, emaciated, shivering with cold or sweating with fever. Rubbing his thighs, grandfather would say after a portentous pause, "Then came the great thaw." It came as badly as possible. A sudden heat wave. Rushing water bearing boulders and whole trees inundated the valley. The two once mannerly streams joined into a single torrent that swept everything away. People took to ice floes. The nearest dry land was halfway up the mountains. But Opa and Oma gushed with torrents of melted snow. It was Holland with heights but without dikes. With the last of his strength, Father fashioned a crude raft, but it overturned and he was borne away. I was left alone, clinging to the remnants, when the waters at last went down, leaving the valley buried in mud. Those who were still alive fled. Scattered over the country, the survivors found new homes, new lives, and bored their posterity with sentimental nostalgic tales, stories of suffering and horror, all bundled together like the happy children in their woolen blankets. Grandfather always wound up his story with the same words. I fetched up here, and the very first person I met was a pretty red-headed girl. She became your sainted grandmother. When we were still quite little, Grandfather's story struck us hardly different from the ones our parents read to us as we snuggled under our coverlets, safe not only from lethal blizzards, but witches, trolls, and wicked stepmothers. The only difference was that Grandfather's story was true, or at least truer, than the others. Then, as we grew bigger, we decided the story was for babies. We observed that our parents had long ago ceased even to humor the old man, and so, in our turn, we did the same. Grandfather died in his 80th year. As he lay on his deathbed, we were all brought to say our farewells to him. There was a big fire in the hearth. The room was stifling and smelled sour. Nevertheless, Grandfather, under his heaps of blankets, shivered as if he were in the cold of the mountains, and flailed his wasted limbs as if he were trapped in mud and ice. The old man muttered names as well, ones we had never heard before. Fraulein Bertha, Herr Rolf, Paul and Ludwig, Liesel, and Franziska. For 2 summers in my late teens, I hiked in the mountains. Wherever I went, I asked the local villagers and shepherds if they knew of a valley watered by 2 streams, a valley that lay between 2 mountains. But, vividly as I pictured them, I was never able to find Oma and Opa. Hello there. Welcome to No Extra Words, the Flash Fiction podcast. My name is Chris Baker-Dersch. I'm your producer and editor. Not the easiest of bedtime stories on today's show. I am a huge lover of family stories. I was always the last one who would stay in the living room and listen to my great aunt. We called her Other Aunt Marge because I also have an Aunt Marge. She would tell the same story every single time we saw her, and I was always the last one in the living room listening to her story. The thing about family stories is they're not always about the happiest of moments. In fact, sometimes they're about the most tragic of moments. And I've got a good friend who's my genealogy buddy. We often will do family research together, and she has a hard time with the really hard parts of family history, and there are some really hard parts of family history. Her family came over from what is now Poland in the 1920s. We'll just leave it at that. And I always thought there was something wrong with me because, of course, the most horrible of family stories brings out emotions, but I would always want to hear them more and didn't want to hide them and didn't want to shy away from them, even though they were pretty miserable times. And now I just think that's how we deal with hard times that have gone past. And that is why it often becomes the grandchildren that hear the stories, because it can be too painful for that first generation to hear them, but the second generation gets to hear them, and they do become like the bedtime stories of our childhood. And that's how we work through old pain. And that's how we start to make the world okay again. You know, if there's been a tear in the family or a tear in the world or a tear in the universe, it doesn't heal unless it gets exposed to light and cured. It's not the easiest of bedtime stories that are on the show today, but it is those grandfathers telling you what you didn't know you needed to hear. And as usual with grandfathers, telling you the version that they want you to know and letting you fill in those missing pieces. I had a great-grandmother who every single thing that was ever written by her or about her was slightly different, because she would create the version of herself that was most appropriate to that moment. So if she liked one of her husbands at that given time, then that might be the person whose name she would use. We do create the best versions of whatever really rough things life gives us. Coming up next, Stephen Mayoff has a story. Stephen lives on Prince Edward Island. And when I first saw this story go by, you know, like a lot of people, a lot of young girls like me, I was heavily influenced by Anne of Green Gables when I was 11, 12 years old. And that influence has never really, for me, gone away. So Prince Edward Island is this place that lives large in my imagination. So seeing that was where he was from and seeing that his story was called The Two Annes, it was sort of like, I can't not air this. And then reading it and realizing what it really is actually about was like, thank God he gave me a story so much deeper than that works on so many different levels. And so I'm really proud to bring you Stephen Mayoff and The Two Annes, which goes far beyond the image of the Anne of Prince Edward Island that I ever had. Rather than continuing to talk about the story and ruin it, I'm going to bring it to you. Thank you for being around for some not so easy to hear stories today. Hope that maybe they brought some catharsis to you like they did to me. And I will see you guys here in a couple of weeks on the show for 2 more stories. Take care.
The Two Annes. Samson Grief sits at a cafe patio, tipping back a bottle of Keith's. On the table is his sketch pad and pencil. In the distance is a grinning scar of rich red shoreline. White-tipped breakers rise and curl into question marks before crashing against a ridge of rocks. It's been a pleasant holiday, tooling around in his beat-up Lada to a succession of historic lighthouses, provincial parks, and craft shops. Sketching fishermen harvesting Irish moss on the shore of North Cape. Stuffing himself at a new Glasgow lobster supper. The inevitable tour of Green Gables house in Cavendish. Tomorrow, he is supposed to drive back home to Toronto to start a job in an ad agency. His father had asked, "Why Prince Edward Island?" Samson merely shrugged. "I've never been there." He recently graduated from the Ontario College of Art. His parents offered to send him to Amsterdam, thinking he'd like to see a bit of his heritage in remembrance of his late grandfather. Zeta Jacob had lived with them when Samson was a child, later moving into the Maimonides Home for Seniors. 2 girls sit at a far table on the patio. One has red hair, the other's is blue-black. Samson opens the pad to a blank sheet. When Zeta Jacob was still living in the upstairs extra room, he used to tell Samson about the Nazi occupation of Amsterdam, the overcrowded cattle cars rattling to the Westerbork transit camp and then on to Auschwitz. "Couldn't you just run away?" Sometimes the old man would shrug, "Where could I go?" Or else his eyes lit up wildly. "What, and give those bastards the satisfaction of shooting me?" The waitress brings milkshakes to the girls' table. They sip, giggling to themselves. Samson draws on his pad, capturing distinctive features in a few strokes. The red head's upturned nose, the dark one's penetrating eyes. Every night Zeta Jacob told about people being starved and gassed. To Samson, these were merely bedtime stories. He was only ever scared when woken up by his grandfather's screams from down the hall. The old man must have given himself nightmares with his own stories. Samson gives the red-headed girl pigtails and a wide straw hat. After his grandfather died, he ate little and spent days in bed. His parents were worried that he might not graduate. Samson didn't care one way or the other. He quickly sketches a Star of David armband for the dark-haired girl. A sleeve is rolled up to reveal numbers on her forearm. His two misfit Anns stare back at him, one with freckles around her nose, the other with shadows under her eyes. Each girl's hand clasping the other's, unwilling to let go. Where can any of us go? He says this to himself. A wave crashes against the distant rocks. Samson breathes deeply, slipping into a world reduced to salt and light. The water recedes, then swells once more. He feels his grandfather's wild eyes blazing inside his brain.
Thanks for listening to the No Extra Words podcast. For more information on today's stories and contributors, or to learn how to submit your own work, please visit us at noextrawords.wordpress.com. The best support you can give the show is to recommend us to your family and friends. See you next time.